Hello everyone, this is Teacher Marsha and welcome back to another session of my tutorials. Today we're going to talk about classifying shapes. So what do we mean by classifying? Classifying means putting objects into groups based on the property or the properties that they have. So in this session, we will only focus on grouping shapes according to their properties. To begin with, I want you to look at the shapes. How can the shapes be grouped? Can you think of a way of grouping these shapes? Well, obviously, we can group the shapes according to the type of the shape. There are only two types of shape from the given sets of objects. Number one, we have the square, and the second one, we have the circle. So we can group these shapes according to their type. So can we group them? Let us go to the second example. Look at the following shapes. Which shape does not belong in the group? The rectangle does not belong in the group. As you notice, all of the shapes are square and there is only one rectangle. So we can group this shape according again to their type. So we have the square and the rectangle. Now let's go to the third example. Look at the shapes. Which shape does not belong in the group? Can you guess? The shape that does not belong in the group is this shape. Why? Because this shape has 5 sides and the rest of the shapes have 4 sides and we call them quadrilaterals. All of the shapes are quadrilaterals except this shape which we call irregular pentagon. Irregular pentagon because it has 5 sides. While all of the shapes are what we call quadrilaterals. So we group the shapes according again to their type or to the number of sides. Let's go to the last example. Look at the shapes. What did you notice? Which is the shape that does not belong in the group below? It is this shape. Why? Because this shape is not a circle. While the rest of the shapes are circle, this shape is what we call oval. Right? So we categorize the shapes according again to the type. So the rest of the shapes are circle, while this shape is what we call oval. Now that you know how to classify the shape, let's try to answer the practice exercises from your student book and from your workbook. Let's start with your student book, page 181. Which is the shape that does not belong in the group? Put a cross in the box next to the shape. So let's look at the set of the shapes. So from this, you can see that this shape doesn't belong to the group, as this shape is what we call quadrilateral, while the rest of the shapes are triangles. Just continue with letter B and letter C. Moving on, let's continue answering your workbook. Let's start with number 1. The shapes below can be grouped in 2 ways. Put a tick in the box for each correct classification. So look at the shapes first. Then we will take the 2 ways on how to classify the shapes. So letter A, groups of squares and triangles. Letter B, groups of triangles, squares, and circles. Letter C, groups of squares, triangles, and rectangles. Letter D, groups of gray and red shapes. And letter E, group of green and red shapes. So the answer for this question is first, letter C, groups of squares, triangles, and rectangles. So we have triangles, we have squares, and we also have rectangles. So that's the first way of classifying the shapes. And the second one is letter F, groups of gray and green shapes. Let's continue with number 2. The shapes below can be grouped in 3 ways. Put a tick in the box for each correct classification. So you're going to look at the shapes and you're going to tick 3 ways on how to classify the shapes according to the following options. Letter A, groups of green shapes and gray shapes. Letter B, groups of triangles, rectangles, and squares. Letter C, groups of big shapes and small shapes. Letter D, groups of squares and circles. Letter E, groups of green shapes and orange shapes. Letter F, groups of squares, triangles, and circles. Letter G, groups of triangles and circles. And last, letter H, groups of gray shapes and yellow shapes. For question number 3, cross out the shape that does not belong in the group. So which shape does not belong in the group in letter A? You just have to cross it out. Same with letter B and letter C. So here you can classify the shapes according to color and according to size. For number 4, cross out the shape that does not belong in the group. Again, so here you can classify the shape according to the type of the shape for letter A, for letter B, also according to the type of the shape, and for letter C, according to the type of shape and according to color. So there are 2 ways to classify letter C. For letter D, it's according to the number of sides. So you have to count the number of sides of every shape. For letter E, there are 2 classifications. Number 1 is the type of the shape. And the second one is the number of sides. So which does not belong in those 2 classifications, you have to cross it out. Okay? So that ends my session for today. Thank you all for watching and I hope to see you all again next week. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.